Hello and welcome back to part 2 of the lecture. In this part I'm going to look at Roald Dahl before going on in part 3 to draw the text from this week together. I'm going to look again at very controversial issues, so remember that at the start of the lecture there was just that little content warning about the kind of issues we're going to be discussing in the lecture, and please check the slides ahead to make sure you're going to be comfortable listening to that discussion. So, to start with Dahl, one of the assertions that's been made most frequently about his book The Witches, but also some of his other texts as well, is that they are misogynistic. And this criticism has extended also to Nicholas Roeg's film of The Witches, which was the focus in particular of the article that I've put on the Ellie Forum for you to read by Anne-Marie Bird called Women Behaving Badly. This is really about the feminism of the 1980s, and it was an approach to the witches which stressed the idea that Dahl equated witches with femininity. And we can examine that claim when we look at the text in the seminars. This is what she has to say in her article. Catherine Itzin, in 1985, claims that Dahl's text bears a striking similarity to Kramer and Sprenger's misogynistic text Malleus Maleficarum. So we see our old friend here. And Itzin's claim is that really The Witches, Dahl's children's novel, is not that much different to Malleus Maleficarum. It's a big claim, isn't it? And a really interesting one, I think. Both texts, Bird goes on to say, though separated by over 400 years, match the anxiety of the authors to reassure themselves that women, not men, could be witches. The Witches is a dangerous publication. It reinforces culturally conditioned misogyny. However, Bird says Itzin's criticism would seem more appropriate to Nicholas Roeg's 1989 film adaptation of The Witches, which might seem more in line with traditional criticisms of witches, especially those outlined in the 1486 Witch Hunter's Manual, Malleus Maleficarum. So both these writers are circling round the idea that the novel and the film are like Malleus Maleficarum and are equally misogynistic with that early demonological text. This is how Bird sums up the argument on the next slide. Demonising women who refuse to conform to patriarchal strictures is not a new phenomenon. An examination of the documented evidence of the witch hunts and trials from the 15th century to the 18th century reveals a connection between a woman's social status and her representation as evil. Accusations of witchcraft arising from irrational but deeply felt fears and social anxieties appear to have intensified in direct response to periods of social, economic, political and sexual unrest among women, which is a claim historians have examined. And if you look in, say, Darren Aldridge's book The Witchcraft Reader, which is on the module's further reading list, you can see debates about that issue. In these societies, any woman who was perceived to be deviant in some way, assertive, too successful, nonconformist, in short, any woman who challenged the patriarchal order, might be suspected of witchcraft. A contemporary female, such as Mrs. Thatcher, again remember this is a text from the 1980s, attracted great public interest, not simply because of her radical policies, but primarily because she was the first female Prime Minister of a Western state. Patriarchy has a vested interest in dehumanising successful women who threaten male subjectivity. I think it's a really interesting argument, and it's one that is borne out to some extent with other and more contemporary female figures, Hillary Clinton, for example, and other people who have been picked on and demonised with the word witch over the course of recent political history. Although we've also got some really interesting counterexamples and claims by men, particularly Donald Trump, of course, that he has been the victim of a witch hunt. And we can talk about how we feel about that usage of the word witch in political context as we go through the seminars. If you look at the next slide, one of the ways that people approach the film of Dahl's The Witches was by looking at the figure of the Grand High Witch herself, and particularly comparing her visual appearance to the Spitting Image, the satirical TV series now revived, so helpfully I don't have to explain what that is. their puppet of Margaret Thatcher. They don't look particularly alike in these images, I think, but I think you can see that there's a sort of general continuum of this kind of rubber-faced hag, if you like. And they were thought to be sufficiently like each other to cause quite a bit of commentary when the film first came out about how this appeared to be an attack on a female leader. So there was a really interesting debate around that, and I think the issue of visual imagery is again important here, as it has previously been often in the course of the module. What the witch looks like, the physical appearance, the signs by which you might identify a witch, are concerns within Dahl's novel, and he gives us two pictures of a woman and a witch standing next to each other to help us think about that visual appearance and how far it's identifiable. But he also talks about the hidden visual appearance, the underlying hideousness of the witch, which is under the mask, and the wig and the shoes that the women who are in fact witches wear. In a sense, they're not really women, are they? The text makes us think about them as demons. Their bodies are inhuman, they have inhuman abilities, but yet they disguise themselves as ordinary human women. And therefore, the text makes us think about femininity, appearance, the portrayal of witches in texts and also in visual texts like films. There are also other criticisms of Dahl as a writer, and indeed as a thinker in the mid-20th century, and these concern anti-Semitism, so I'm going to deal with those in this part of the lecture as well. If you move on to the next slide, you can see some of the recent debates around Dahl's politics, which have indeed influenced public perception of him as a public figure. There were a number of plans to celebrate Roald Dahl as a prominent British children's author, as if you like a kind of British export, under various governments throughout the course of the early 20th century, but they have all fallen by the wayside because some of Dahl's views, which were expressed fairly clearly, were actually deeply problematic, and they particularly centred on Jewishness and depictions of Jewishness. And again, if you look back at the appearance of the Grand High Witch and some of the other figures in his novels, there has been a persistent strain of criticism which has suggested that these are not just misogynistic but also anti-Semitic stereotypes, particularly in their visual appearance. So here is an article about the suggested appearance of a Royal Mint Roald Dahl commemorative coin series as late as 2018, where Streeting, Labour MP and co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group on British Jews, added, and this is obviously from a longer article, Roald Dahl's children's stories were my favourite books growing up, and they will always occupy a special place in my heart. There's certainly no reason why future generations of children shouldn't continue to enjoy those stories. But I think it's absolutely clear that the Royal Mint made the right decision in cancelling any plans for such a series of commemorative coins, because there is just no excusing or explaining away Roald Dahl's comments and his views, which were anti-Semitic. It is as simple as that. This isn't borderline anti-Semitism. This is classic, undeniable, blatant anti-Semitism. I think when it comes to celebrating individuals, these factors ought to be taken into account. And I'm going to ask you later on as one of the questions during the course of the lecture, how you feel about that, how far we should take into account an author's views when we assess their contribution to literature, when we look at their works. In some ways, and this is also an interesting point, I think, for those of us who have never really known this side of Roald's character, it's quite upsetting, actually. I also want us to think about our own personal relationship with texts and how we respond to the views of authors, which they may express at the time or subsequently, or may become aware of at the time or subsequently. Again, that relationship between author and text is really interesting, I think, and something for us to consider carefully. And David Baddiel has also spoken out about Dahl in a similar way. Last year, Jewish comedian David Baddiel said he was refusing to celebrate Roald Dahl Day because of the author's views. He tweeted Dahl's New Statesman quote, which is one of the ones that I've omitted from this section, but you can see the kind of things that Dahl did say. Adding, though a massive fan of his work, I won't be celebrating Roald Dahl Day. So there is a really interesting series of issues going on here around personal views of authors, our reception of those as readers, the ways in which we incorporate that into the discussion in the public realm of the works and the authors. And there's also an economic aspect to all of this. You know, authors like Rowling and Dahl are often seen as the property of one culture or another, and thus the export potential of those is massive. You'll often see references to how much the Harry Potter franchise, for example, has brought to the British economy, to the British film industry, and so on. So there is an economic aspect, there is a marketing aspect to all of these decisions about the ways in which the authors represent such groups as Jews, women, and the way in which they incorporate all of those into depictions of witches. So there's some really sensitive material going on here, I think. And if you look at the next slide, I want us to think about whether that's inevitable. We are, after all, dealing with depictions of witches here, aren't we? They're the ultimate hate figure, they're the ultimate scapegoat in an awful lot of different ways. And I think this does mean that they are often debated with anger. I think some of the issues that we're dealing with here are issues where witches have come to stand in for other kinds of demonised groups. And they've come to stand in ways which allow us to think about hatred, allow us to think about the binary construction of ideas, as we have done in previous weeks, where one group is in and one group is out. One group is safe, one group is absolutely not safe. One group is to be persecuted by the other group. And we've talked in the past about how far this is a kind of default human structuring, how far it's to do with linguistic structures. Remember the Stuart Clark article, Inversion, Misrule and the Meaning of Witchcraft, and how far it's something that we naturally fall into, and how we can stop ourselves doing that as human beings if we find different ways to talk about these issues of hatred, scapegoating, binariness. I think in particular these issues have come to the fore around witchcraft texts in modern times, in the 21st century. The concept of culture war, which is so current at the moment, so a war between, if you like, radical and conservative elements in society, or liberal aspects of society and conservative aspects of society, however you want to describe that. You can also use more extreme terms, most clearly. But the idea of a culture war is, I think, one that really lends itself to discussions about witchcraft and magic. We saw a medieval culture war going on around witchcraft in the demonologies of Kramer and Sprenger and others. And in a sense, we've updated that concept when witches stand in for other groups. So we can often talk about issues of race, class, gender, sex, sexuality through the medium of the figure of the witch, and that tends to lead us to have angry and binary and polarising discussions around them. I do want us to think about how far we regard this as suitable material for children's fiction too. Are these essential? Should we teach children immediately about hatred and division and difficulty, and, if you like, the banality of evil as it's often described on the contemporary school curriculum? Is it in fact essential that we have witches in children's fiction so that they help us talk about these issues? Or should they, as some writers and some critics have suggested, should they in fact be prohibited because they bring into the child's world, the child's mind, inherently those notions of scapegoating, those notions of hatred, the notion that there is always another group who must be hated? I guess it depends how you frame it, how you have that discussion with your child readers, your child viewers, and how you build that into the educative system. Certainly we've seen with discussions of the Salem witches that witches are often discussed in curricula, particularly in the United States, and children are encouraged to think about the ways in which they might have previously identified other groups within their society, in very much the same way that people once identified witches. But of course this is highly controversial, and parent groups and teacher groups and political groups are constantly wanting to have a say on it, mostly in a very angry form, unfortunately. So I want us to think about what place witches have in that debate about tolerance and hatred, really. I also want us to start looking at the slightly lighter side of the witch, again in culture, because although these very serious issues are debated in the figure of the witch, clearly there are also other kinds of cultural discussion going on, and some of those are about the nature of entertainment. So going back to the Monty Python clip with which we started the module, witches are at once very serious and very trivial. The next slide is some reviews of the 2020 film of The Witches, the Dahl book. And you can see some of the issues that are coming up here, and you can see that the tone lightens considerably. So there is discussion of some of the broader cultural elements incorporated into the text, The Witches in its many forms. But there's also that tendency that particularly film reviewers have. Again, think about writing your own reviews when you look at these from the website Rotten Tomatoes. There is a tendency to be a bit flip sometimes, and there is a tendency to go for a good line or go for a funny statement to draw the reader in. Sometimes that's a difficult balance to strike, I think, when you're dealing with a film which, in this case, for example, explicitly deals with questions of race and gender and tries to do so in ways which move the debate along a bit. Now, whether it succeeds or not is for you to decide as critics, as reviewers. But you can see here again, oh look, a binary polarisation. So we have 3 rotten reviews and we have 3 ripe reviews. And you can search the site and look at what people have to say about the film. But I want us to think about the ways in which we can learn from the angry debate, and we can set it alongside a debate which is really rather more about cultural preferences, and how to negotiate that language, how to negotiate that line in talking about works when you write a review yourself, for example. Please go on to exercise 2. We can start having a look at some of these issues. So think about what the remaking of The Witches in 2020 as a film tells us about witchcraft as a continued threat or opportunity. Are witches still seen as a threat, or are they primarily seen as entertaining? Why have they resurfaced in culture at this time and in this way? Please also think, as you did with Rowling, about Dahl's books. How did you encounter them as a child, if you did? What were your impressions of them then? And also, finally, that larger question, how far it's possible or desirable to separate the views of writers as individuals from our discussion of their works. It's clearly a theme that's going to come up quite a bit over this week and the coming week.